Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. We've been doing these programs since lockdown began, and we've been concentrating in the main, as you know, on medical, ethical, and legal questions, sometimes economic, dealing with COVID-19 and its impact. But there are all the broader issues which we should be speaking about. And I was struck the other day by reading that Redi Tlhabi, who's my guest, and I'll introduce him in a second, is doing a new book. And that sort of fascinated me for a whole range of reasons, which I'll come to, apart from the fact that her last book seemed to have did have very significant impact on me, quasi, but we'll get there too. So I'm very delighted to welcome Redi Tlhabi, who of course first came to many of our attention through 702 and then went to much more elevated heights of vision, of writing, and a whole range of other issues, and has enriched our public discourse in all manner of means. So Redi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Just generally, the country seems to be in a strange position whereby in COVID, people have really been despairing and feeling a loss of hope. Am I right in reading it that way? And how do you read the country as we sit here at the beginning of April 2021, literally a year into this lockdown?
You know, I think that the beginning of COVID and even now, South Africans demonstrated something that you don't find in other countries, a level of tolerance and patience with their leaders that I find astounding. And I know that the vaccine situation is quite complex and there are global issues that put us at a disadvantage, that put our government at a disadvantage. But there's so many other issues for which our government should answer. But from a public reaction point of view, they just get away with murder. It's the same with corruption, all the things that happen. South Africans, I thought, even with COVID, they were willing to be obedient, they were willing to be collaborative, they were supporting the government and some of the draconian and silly measures. It was like the government knows best. And even with the police brutality that we saw, there were people who were still defending the government. But just generally, I'm just getting a sense that we are quite a patient and a tolerant bunch, even to our own detriment. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that, you know, again, it's like we're waiting for the government to lead and give us some relief and tell us that it's going to be okay. And that concerns me. That concerns me. I'd like to see a little bit more anger, a little bit more impatience, if you will. But then the last thing is there's been so much grief and so much loss. And I, for one, the number of people I know who have died, I can't get my head around it. I can't get my head around it. And I just wonder what we're going to do with our collective grief when all of this is over. So yeah, it's a combination of things.
It's a lot to digest, and I agree with all of that. I suppose the real question which worries many people, included, is we've had so much sort of, you know, we're going to get so much vaccine today, tomorrow, God knows when, and we never get it. It's like that Samuel Beckett play, Waiting for Godot. It never comes.
Yes.
I wonder what that does in the longer run to people's confidence in government. You know, that eventually government gets to the point where you say, well, you aren't telling us the truth. You aren't being candid with us. I mean, you're right that we've been patient, but I get a sense people are running out of patience now.
Yeah.
And particularly wave, and more people will die when we could have had a vaccine. I don't know. It seems to me that.
Yeah. You know, I was actually thinking just a few minutes before I spoke to you that I don't want to see any more vaccine stories. And it's my fault because I'm always on social media. It serves me right. Because if I don't want to see them, I must move. Because the last one I saw literally a few minutes ago was that Janssen, the South African, the registration body for medications, it's like SAPRA. I can't say the whole acronym, but the people who authorize the use of a particular medicine have just now agreed to register the J&J vaccine, which of course has been used for medical workers and so on, but now for commercial purposes, it's going to. And then following that, is an announcement which is good news, because it could mean that the vaccine would be available mid-April. Don't say that to me. I don't like these this first quarter of this. And I was just saying, when did we start speaking like this? Is it the 10th of April or the 15th of April? Is it the 20th or the 27th? Is it the 2nd of May? I can't stand the way we normalize certain words and certain language. Since when do we speak, this is going to happen mid-April, first quarter, we'll get herd immunity by last quarter of the year? I can't stand it. I don't know what it all means. I really don't know what it all means. But what I do know is that somehow the media, mainstream media, has been the greatest gift to our government as a public relations platform. Let me take ownership, because I'm also in the mainstream media. We've gifted the government with free PR. They've been able to make these kind of announcements at press conferences to say, South Africa will get a vaccine soon. And that's what you report. What's soon? So I think by the time that we awakened to the enormity of the problem, it was too late. The government had already kind of dominated I hate the word narrative because it's so overused. They dominated the space from a communications point of view, and have managed to persuade us that the West is to blame. Now, it's that kind of thing where two things can be true at the same time. People who are hoarding the vaccine, Canada, the US, and all those politics surrounding access to healthcare, those things are so true. They are so true. But it is also true that our government obfuscated as well, that they didn't pay on time. Those things were true, that they didn't take chances. COVAX, some African countries, let's compare ourselves to our equals. They are doing better than we are. So there is a level of impatience, but also I think the situation has been so complicated that even when you feel the temptation to be enraged, you think, oh, maybe I don't understand this. They've made it look like it's this murky world of vaccines that, we let them get away without further scrutiny because it is also complicated. But I will agree with you on one thing. I'm sensing there was a time, when you criticize the ANC on radio and on Twitter, people would come down hard on you, hard. But it feels as if even diehard ANC fans are too embarrassed to defend the country, because deep down they know that all the criticism is justified. That corruption that came, the PPE scandals. So I guess I'm saying that we feel overwhelmed by the vaccine situation because somehow what's been reported has made it look like it's so complicated, you'll never understand it. It's so complicated, those guys are to blame, these guys are to blame, and so the government has gotten off scot-free. But from an ANC government and its relationship with citizens, I'm getting a sense that if you're going to go on social media today and defend the ANC government, you will meet the wrath of the people. And even though I know that life doesn't only happen on social media, as a talk show host, I am sensing that right now it's almost safe to be hard-hitting on the ANC, and your rant will stand without much challenge.
Yeah, I accept that. I suppose I don't want to defend the mainstream media, who I've been critical about for years, but a couple of things. There also seems to be an extraordinary level of accountability. Personally, on these shows, for example, I'm happy to name, I tried to get Professor Karim a few times. Come on, flatly refuses to do an interview with me. There are lots of people like that, flatly refuse. If you take the broader issue, I mean, I've been amazed that even Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, which is hardly what you would call the sort of people you wish to aspire to, even those two reprobates have effectively had press conferences. Our president, who's incredibly eloquent, there's not been one time where the press publicly able to ask him the questions that you've put up now. We get these chats from him, and that's the end of it. So I'm curious as to why the government is not allowing the media to essentially broadcast a sense of accountability. The president goes before people, there's a proper press conference, we all see hard questions asked, and he answers them. The kind of things that you've just said now.
Look, it was the bane of my existence when I was on the radio, and even now I share your view as somebody who's been at the receiving end of that, people not wanting to like thinking that it's okay on a public matter to say no comment, or to put out these spokespeople who actually are not the decision makers. And I remember tweeting about exactly this, that if President Cyril Ramaphosa's advisors think they are doing him any favors by not opening him up to challenge and robust interviewing, they're doing him a disservice, because he comes across as weak and incapable. And I don't want to take credit for tweeting, but I do know that a week later, the president was almost paraded, and I use that word deliberately, that it was this kind of staged pageantry, you know, that you will go to Power FM for 5 minutes, you will go to SAFM, ENCA. So when the first interview happened, I went, bravo. And then I realized that everybody got that interview. And what likely happened there was that the presidency was given the names of the people who would be conducting the interviews. Or let me start at the beginning. Perhaps the presidency offered these interviews to all these media entities, and maybe even chose who would interview him. Or if they didn't choose, they asked for names in advance, and perhaps even asked for not specific questions, but which angles will you be covering? And that is below par, I think.
Yeah, no, that's right.
You know, I mean, why can he not stand there and answer spontaneously? Why can he not stand there and show his grasp of issues? And I just think that it is the ugliest part, or one of the ugliest parts of being a journalist in South Africa, that we don't have that much access, that is controlled by the powers that be, the decision makers. They choose when to speak to us. It doesn't matter the urgency of the moment. They can decide to drag it on for 4 weeks. And when the time comes, it is so, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but it's so clinical, so staged. And it's these two presenters interviewing. There's never that robust, spontaneous, challenging, but. And I don't understand what our politicians, why they feel they need to be protected from the public and the media.
I certainly don't think that I can't understand why the president should be. I mean, of all of our presidents, you know, perhaps, you know, because Mr. Mandela had massive charisma, but Mr. Beck was thoughtful. But the fact that we have a president who I think combines all of that, he's a very charming, thoughtful, eloquent man. There seems to be no reason why. I mean, you know, I'd love to have him for a half an hour on this program. I'm quite sure that I'd do no damage to him, because he'd probably come out and say, gee, he answered all those really hard questions incredibly well. We're proud to have a president to understand it. But I wonder if I can move on to another point that you said about anger. I asked this to Judge Cameron when I interviewed him, and I'm intrigued by your answer too. Talked about people dying. A lot of people have died, well, too many, at the hands of the police. I was particularly interested when that, which has sort of been in my head, when that boy Julius died.
Yes, in El Dorado Park.
He was murdered by the police, yes, and or allegedly at least. And at that time, Black Lives Matter were really at their height in America. And I thought, gee, Americans, even white Americans were coming out and protesting George Floyd. How do we allow an equally great, if not a greater tragedy? Because children, that's like, sorry, that's just not there. Why have we been so passive about this?
Sure, you know, your questions, it's like you're sitting at my dining room table in the evening.
Oh, good.
When we talk about
I'll invite myself. I'll invite myself after COVID. Yeah.
You're welcome, because I made the same observation about American society, that you can say whatever you want. Even in London, you can say whatever you want about them. But I have seen, even over the years, not just last year, Black Lives and Me Too marches that are multiracial, across classes, across genders, in ways that we haven't managed to do in South Africa. And I admire that, and I'm jealous. I'm jealous. Is it that they've been a democracy for way longer than we have? Is it that after many years, they've had some common experiences, and maybe we haven't managed to have common experiences across gender, across class, because I can tell you with the little boy and everybody else who has been a victim of police brutality, from Andries Tatani to,
yes,
we
of
are
course.
outraged. We are outraged. There's a class thing about it. You don't find people like myself marching with the people who are fighting for water. And I want to use myself and not point the finger at anybody else. And I represent a particular class, educated, I'm living comfortably, so our protests, in fact, our protests are never based on the principle of the matter. I think it is whether or not this affects me. So if the El Dorado Park community marched against the murder of that little boy, they are likely to be marching alone with a couple of cameras there, and I'm likely to be sitting in front of my TV saying, this is horrible, and I'll probably write an article. Write an article about it. But I don't have an answer for why we're not galvanized into action and are able to leave our homes to go and march with the people who are affected by whatever it is the march is about. The xenophobia, the anti-xenophobia march, and I must give credit to 702 when it happened. That was a couple of years ago, and we're able to rally people on radio. It wasn't a spontaneous outpouring of grief and solidarity. It was us behind those microphones, just rallying people and lobbying people, and then that march happened at Constitutional Hill. So somehow we are able to claim that we are good people, but not act in solidarity with people who are affected by that which we claim to be against.
I want to come back to that, but before I do, because of time, for some reason I reread your book, not for this interview, a while back. And it struck me that you had probably said something more forcible in that book, or right through that book, of our legal system than any other book I've ever read. In fact, I now recommend it to everybody because of what the legal system did to that woman.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, I know you're writing another book about, as I understand, about women and about gender, etc. Do you think we've learned from that?
Okay, so yes and no. Let me tell you why I say yes. Because when you look at student leaders and young activists, young women in particular, I am finding that they are speaking out far sooner than my generation would have on certain matters. I am finding that in their protests, Fees Must Fall, for example, while I was sitting in studio thinking it was all about fees, and I interviewed young women students from Wits University, Stellenbosch, Rhodes, and in Cape Town, they turned the conversation around, and I'm getting goosebumps because I remember this day. I had prepared for a different type of interview. They turned things around and took on their male counterparts and said, we are marching with you for fees, but we're not going to tolerate your misogyny. This movement has been misogynistic. They were putting the spotlight there, and they are so angry. And I think they're carrying the anger of so many generations before them, but they are maybe, I don't know, maybe it is the exuberance and the courage of youth, but I'm finding that they are far more eloquent in debating gender. There were times on the Big Debate, a TV show that I did, where I used the phrase corrective rape because that's what I knew. And a young activist, challenged me on that, saying even the phrasing of this is problematic because we are presuming there is something to correct, that there's a right and wrong gender. So this is correct. And she was generous enough to say, I understand what you mean, but even this we are rejecting. Even this we are rejecting. So have we learned anything? I am finding that my interactions with young women at universities, in communities, they are far more robust and far more visible and bold, and they remember the story of Fezekile Kuzwayo, and I use the name Kwezi because that's her comrade, that's her struggle name, as it were. They know about that story, and also they're not prepared to put up with toxic and predatory men. And it's not to say that there aren't their counterparts in rural areas and other townships who are still overwhelmed and do not have a voice. But I'm just finding that there's a level of rage, but not just rage, there's reflection about what gender means, what toxic masculinity means, what does it mean to be abused, sexual harassment. They're just broadening even the definitions of things. So from that point of view, yes. But have we learned anything? I don't know. I mean, from a legal point of view, do we have more convictions of rape? Do we have police officers who are sensitized and sensitive to what it means for a woman or a child for that matter, or a man for that matter, to be raped and abused? Do we have at an institutional level a different type of response? I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that we do. But I think a lot of institutions are speaking out far more because they do not want to invite the wrath of the public. And I think social media is playing a role. The time at which a transgression happens and the moment at which it can be exposed, that distance at that time is shortening, and nobody wants to, attract negative coverage. Social media can make or break people, and it annoys me, but also it thrills me.
But just on that, two questions that flow from that. You reproduced in that book a long extract from the cross-examination of Kwesi, a long cross-examination in which, to be quite frank, the judge allowed it all to happen. I was interested whether there was any reaction when you published the book, either
any reaction, you said?
Any reaction to that by the legal community or by anybody for that matter, because you read that and you realize, for me, and I'm probably using the wrong word, that woman was being raped again as the examination went through and as you reproduced it. And you just looked at this, and I felt deep shame for a legal system of which I was a part.
Yeah, I did get a lot of reaction, but I got the reaction from a few friends before publishing, after I'd made the point, that is. I'll tell you why that was important to me, because I wanted it to be clear that I'm not a legal expert, that I'm not arguing from any knowledge of the law, because I felt that if I read too much on what the law says, I'm going to be intimidated and I'm not going to be authentic and express what I felt at a visceral level. That just reading this as a reasonably intelligent girl who has no legal background, just reading this questioning around her sexual partners, even the ones that she'd already consented, she'd already said that she had consensual sex with this person and that person. She was asked about that. And I immediately, as a young woman, thought, that's slut shaming. It's just to say, oh, she sleeps with people, she doesn't remember their names, and so on. And I made the point that women are allowed to have forgettable sex with equally forgettable men. But she was being bullied for that. And so I consulted my friends who are in the legal fraternity after that particular point. And I was amazed at how many went, it was outrageous. And so I felt strong and validated, and I didn't phone my publishers and say we have to change this, we have to change that. And after publishing, one of my mates did inform me that I think that the regulations or the law changed. You can't question a woman about her sexual, or a rape survivor, rape victim, about their sexual history, who they were with before is irrelevant, and so on. And there was reaction. I really, really was so moved by the humility of a lot of experts. And I'm talking academics, and I'm talking lawyers as well. Because in the talks to which I was invited, and you'd know about this as an author yourself, after the book is published, it's one talk after another, I'd get an invitation from the sociology department at WITS, at UJ. And I wouldn't ask who's introducing me, who's going to be doing the panel discussion. And then I'm sitting there, and there's this acclaimed and respected professor who does an introduction to the book and goes on to that theme, that particular theme of law and justice. It seems to have resonated with so many people. And to go to academic institutions and speak to people who studied these things, in a far more in-depth way than I have. There was reaction, and it was positive. It was positive, and I was thrilled. I didn't get this, people sometimes say when you're an expert, whether a judge or a doctor, you don't take kindly to a lay person questioning or challenging you. I didn't get that at all. I was literally validated at all times, and I was humbled by how many people who are so respected took it well and reflected on it.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I do teach that part in my legal theory course every year to students.
Oh, good.
Basically, as you know, even at UCT, it's become a much more diverse and reflective of our demography group. And I tell you, it does get through to them. But I wanted to ask you another question, which is a more touchy subject. Recently, on the commission, we've had an experience which became a national one of a very senior advocate shouting at a junior advocate. And I don't want to get race into this, but the senior advocate was a man and the junior advocate was a woman. And I don't watch, you'll be interested to know, I don't know anything about social media, but my producer for my TV program told me, surprisingly, that issues here of, as it were, if you call toxic masculinity or masculinity asserting themselves, actually did not go down well, and that transcended the racial divide. Now, I don't know if that's correct, but it seems to me an important issue to debate.
It is a very important issue to debate, particularly at this moment in our history as a nation. I think that there is a lot of hypocrisy. There is a lot of anxiety about a whole lot of things. It's not just COVID that is doing this. No. I think that at some point there's a section of our population, Black, that feels a reckoning, that feels that the life that they thought we would have is not the one. There's a section of the white population that also feels we voted in the referendum to end apartheid. We embraced the rainbow nation. We actually thought we're moving forward. Now we're being hammered for every ill in society. That's the second bit. And then there are the politicians, of course, who instead of accounting for their corruption and what they haven't delivered, will pick on these anxieties and make us turn against each other, even though there are real structural issues that we haven't managed to change as South Africa. But just going back to that particular incident, if Advocate Mpofu had been white, telling a Black advocate to shut up, I can tell you right now that the reaction would have been very, very different. Very different. You cannot be white and tell a Black person to shut up. And although we probably don't have enough time to get into whether can Black people be racist, and I believe we can be. I believe we can be. But that's a debate for another day. But the hypocrisy, this instinct to first look at the identity of the person, man or woman, Black or white, before you decide whether something is right or wrong. I am left speechless by anybody thinking that in a judicial formal inquiry, you can actually tell your colleague, regardless of her gender and her race, to shut up. And that there's even a debate about it. And you've noticed I haven't, I'm deliberately not even using Advocate Mpofu's name. I'll get to that in a moment.
I didn't mention him at all. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but just the issue. Are we really debating? Whether it's okay to turn to your colleague and say, shut up? In a diary meeting, let's leave the Judicial Commission in a court. In a diary meeting, the presenter is probably the most senior in terms of work experience, income, everything. You're most likely sitting with people who are younger than you. And I know that I challenge my producers. I push hard. I cannot imagine a moment that could ever justify shut up. It's humiliating. It says, I don't see you. And it also says, now bringing back Advocate Mpofu, as an advocate, he knows what his colleague is doing. It is your job to defend and to question the person sitting in front of you, that he didn't even demonstrate self-mastery and an appreciation of the moment. And you are right not to go to social media, because as much as I think it is a powerful tool and sometimes the conduit for the right information to get through, it can also leave you thinking this is the world. So when there's a noise on Twitter and people are being acerbic and there's this vitriol, you'd swear that there's a section of South Africa, that's South Africa right there. And the louder the people are, the more maybe some of us who are moderates feel overwhelmed. But as I said to someone, that if elections happened on Twitter, then the EFF would be the party in government. So you must understand that incident also from that point of view, those who would support Advocate Mpofu, I'm sure there are others who are not EFF voters, I acknowledge them, but you must understand the Twitter world and who populates that world. So it would look like the whole country is behind him. The whole country is not behind him. I did think that that was inappropriate. And, you know, Judge, he may argue that it had nothing to do with her gender. I'm sorry, but women have spent their lives being told to shut up. There's no other way for us to look at this except through the gender prism. And similarly, if a white person had told a black person to shut up, I probably would also have said, hey, white people have spent their lives telling black people to shut up. That was racist. I would say that. So with Advocate Mpofu saying it, it's not necessarily pretty because it comes from a black man's mouth. And he can't invoke his historical victimhood as a black man in South Africa to give himself the authority to speak to a woman, to speak to a white woman, or to speak to anybody like that. And I do feel that I must issue a disclaimer. I socialize with Daddy. I met my husband. They were good friends many years ago. Even now, we hug and kiss, and I'm very, very fond of him. But on this one, I can't see where he was coming from. It was ugly. It was misogynistic, and I'm also influenced by the aftermath thereof. I know for a fact that she's getting rape threats. I know that for a fact. And it shouldn't shock you, because this is what happens to us women in the media. Karima Brown, and there was no love lost between Karima and I, may her soul rest in peace. She took a particular position in the Zuma years, a position that I in later years never explained. But I have nothing to gain by tarnishing her. Her work is there. People can judge her for herself. But regardless of anything in her work, in her style, in her past, the rape threats that she got from that crowd as well were totally, totally unacceptable. When Zuma mentioned me at the Zondo Commission, I got threatened with rape and a tie around my neck. So that's the instinct of many men when they disagree politically with women, is to threaten us with rape and violence. Just takes me back to your first question. Have we learned anything? Some amongst us haven't.
But can I just, we could have a whole hour on that alone, but I wanted, just because of time, the fact of the matter is that in South Africa today, what complicates the issue is when we talk about historically disadvantaged people, by which we mean black people, they are presently disadvantaged in huge numbers. We have not, the issue of race continues to be a defining character, not entirely, obviously not, but overwhelmingly about whether you get resources or you don't. I mean, COVID, how do we actually start building a much more cohesive image of a non-racial, non-sexist society? It seems to me we've gone backwards. I mean, I'm very troubled by racism in our society.
Okay, so I think that the spirit of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the correct one, even though some young people like to spit at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and blame it for some of our current woes. I think that's an ahistorical position, and they haven't really spent time going through the terms of reference, the recommendations, the outcomes. The fact of the matter, just very briefly, is that there were so many recommendations which would have ensured justice and accountability. But it is this ANC government, a post-democratic government, that chose not to pursue some of those recommendations, apartheid reparations. So I find that someone like Mandela or Desmond Tutu would be maligned for the fact that the leaders didn't do what was recommended, and that is very unfortunate. I get very impatient, I must be honest, with any analysis amongst people who are not interested in history, who are not even curious about the background to a story. What happened? Why were there no reparations? Who was calling for reparations? Because the very same party that didn't pursue this with commitment, it's the populists amongst that same party that will say, right now, reparations were not done. Well, whose bloody fault is that? You are likely to find, even, never mind the EFF, but ANC leaders who will say, de Klerk hasn't accounted, but they won't tell you that government of national unity, how did it come about? How did they themselves accept new national party members? That kind of history is lost because they're trying to deflect and make up for the fact that they failed with the resources and the tools, limited as they were. They failed to move forward in this struggle. So just to get back to your question around we're not there, and yes, it's because the face of poverty in South Africa is black. The face of low wages in South Africa is black. The face of crime, mainly black. Its victims and perpetrators. That's a demographics issue, but it's also a social issue as well. I don't have the answer to how you respond in an anti-racist way to some of these deep, seemingly intractable problems. But my instincts tell me that economic development is the first step. Because here we are, the pie is the small. The pie is the small. The people who own the pie are mainly white, and they're sitting feeling you taking and taking and taking, you're not growing the pie. The people who feel let out don't have proximity to political, let down, don't have proximity to political power. I really don't know how to get into the minds of the people. I don't know how you change minds and hearts, but I do know that if people had the dignity of work, if people had the dignity of education, I think it would be the first step towards looking at each other differently. I think that the more we run out of resources because they are being looted, the more we make decisions based on political survival and expediency and not what's good for our economy, the longer we delay any chance of reconciliation. And reconciliation, not just black and white, but also Black South African and the African migrant worker who's here. Because the Soweto I grew up in, there were migrants from Zimbabwe and Maputo and everywhere. That's a long time ago, it's in the 80s. But even as a university student in the 90s, as a young journalist, a professional early at the turn of the century, I don't remember this much hatred and anger towards African migrants. It is palpable, it is ugly. Where did it come from? And I don't want to be simplistic and say Black South Africans are poor and hungry, so they're taking it out on African migrants. That perhaps could be true, but to make a statement like that, I actually need a very thorough interrogation and some empirical evidence and all of that. But all I know is that when I interviewed people on the radio who were perpetrating this xenophobic violence, I remember one guy who was flashing his ID at me. I was I think I was in Germiston covering the first wave of xenophobic violence in 2008. I remember this guy just waving his green ID. He says, this book must work for me. It must work for me. So that kind of aggressive nationalism. And so creating outsiders. There'll always be outsiders. If I go to, there'll always be outsiders. And being an outsider is not okay, let me say this. that being a visitor, if I immigrate to the UK, to Australia, I am an outsider from that point of view. But how I'm received, I don't have to be received as an outsider. You can receive me as a human being. So I think it's not outsiders that are a problem. It's our desperation to create outsiders that is the problem. So in the context of economic depravity, unemployment, youth unemployment, I want to know who's responsible for my problem. Who's responsible for my problem? It's that person stealing my job. It is that white person not wanting to share. It is Redi Tlhabi, who lives in Hyde Park, who's black and is a woman and comes from Soweto. But from a class point of view, I've attained the upward mobility, the social mobility, and I'm one of the lucky few. But can you blame people for wanting to find a person who's responsible for their situation in life? And perhaps many of us are.
I accept that whole answer, but I just wanted to come back. I also think that perhaps to some extent that lies white people off the hook. Because if you take, I don't mean you mean that deliberately. What I mean by that is, if you take going back to the legal profession, I'm struck by the fact, two things, of an incredible amount, and I'm going to use this word advisedly, black women, African women who've passed my hands over the last decade. Unbelievable talent that never ever gets into the profession.
Yeah.
Get lost. I know for a fact that very talented black counsel at the various bars to get the work that white counsel do. There is a sense of real kind of, racism. I mean, I know the professional howl at me for saying that because they won't say, well, we're not appointing him because he's black. But the truth about it is, we have not been able to reconfigure our norm to understand that you may not speak with a very fancy accent, English accent, you actually still as bloody good in as anybody else.
Yeah.
There are a lot more Tembek and Nikatoibis, with great respect to the refined council, than in fact meet the eye. And I am troubled by that too. And that's resentment too, and rightly so.
Yeah. You know what? You are 100% correct. You reminded me of an interview I did after a gentleman who comes from Limpopo and studied at UJ phoned the show to say, these employment agencies, when they find out you're from Limpopo, you may get an interview and then they hear your accent and they never call you again. They only hire graduates from Cape Town, from UCT and VETS. And there was a placement agency, I don't know something Kelly, that was quite popular many years ago. And one of the ladies from there actually phoned and said, Redi, it is true, exactly like that. It is true, but it's not our fault, when the companies say they don't want that one, but they want this one. I said, so you are confirming. So she confirmed that, that it is true. And I'll forever be fascinated by white people's comfort with being in settings where where the only people around them are those who look and sound like them.
Sound like them, yeah.
It strikes me as an unnatural way of being, that you living in a majority black country, but it's also a global phenomenon. Why is it okay that when you turn around, it's a woman or man who looks like you, and when you turn this way, I don't get that thing, that being comfortable and not saying, hey, this picture doesn't look right. I don't understand what that is about. And also the fact that people are in denial about their hiring practices, that you much rather phone somebody whose name sounds like yours rather than a name you've never heard of before, that people come to workspaces without any curiosity, that when you are at a braai of the neighborhood, you don't think that there's something wrong with your neighborhood, that you all white, middle or upper middle class people, that on the school governing body, the school council, whatever it is, I don't understand. I'm honestly, I don't understand how white people are comfortable. Now, I bet they will hit back and say, we don't seek all whites only institutions. Black people are welcome. That's probably what they'd say. And if I were to go there, they wouldn't chase me away. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about rules and legislation.
Look at the world. Yes.
Yeah, there's no law that prevents a black person from coming. Yes, there isn't. But that you are not actively questioning why your world looks the way that it does and what more you can do to open the door. I'll give you an example that is close to home. That I'm married to a doctor. He practices in Soweto. A lot of his peers practice in Soweto. And I find when we go now to the picnics in the suburb that are mainly white, but we there as the middle to upper middle class Black families whose children go to private schools, and that's the truth. When we're there amongst our white counterparts and they're in the majority, first question you get asked in those spaces is, so what do you do?
Yes.
So I don't mind that question, but my husband, who studied at Orlando High, and there's quite an age gap between us, so he comes from that 1976 generation. You don't ask people what they do. And I said, but what's the problem? I don't mind. He says, yeah, you grew up with white people at boarding school. We don't ask, because don't assume that someone is doing something. Where we come from, having a job or being a doctor, it's like the exception. So when you go and ask someone, what do you do? Chances are they're unemployed. So don't ask questions like that. Anyway, and then he'll tell them what he does. And then, where do you practice? And so that's so far. Do you drive to Soweto every single morning? And I'm thinking, we used to get on the bus and taxi from Soweto to Parktown to go to school. All these children in former Model C schools, not necessarily, not maybe the private school ones, but the former Model C schools, a lot of them still come from the township. But anyway, so they're fascinated by the fact that he drives from Sandton to Soweto. And I overheard a conversation between him and a lot of other Black doctors saying, the funny thing is, if we were to set up a practice in Sandton, they wouldn't come. They wouldn't come. Black doctors see Black people. Black accountants mainly serve Black people. Black interior designers serve Black clientele. I don't know, even amongst my white friends, I don't know any one of them that has a Black doctor or a Black lawyer or a Black accountant. I don't know them. And they pay a fortune for interior deco and stuff. And we just go to the Oriental Plaza. I get my material for my curtains there. I take them to Soweto, and a wonderful, talented mama from Lesotho can just churn out the same type of classy curtains at half the price. But getting back to the point that I bet you amongst my friends, whom I don't believe they have a racist bone in their body, but the fact that when they make doctor's appointment, it doesn't cross their mind to check out an Indian doctor, a Black African doctor, a gynecologist who's Black, an accountant who's, it's not, their service providers, their suppliers look like them. And their only engagement with Black people is as handymen or even friends at school, but providing a service like gardening, domestic work, all of that. So if you're in that kind of world, what makes you think that as a manager making decisions and policy, that kind of world is not going to influence your decision? I just think white people should step out more, especially those who identify as progressives and white liberals, because the Steve Hoff mayors of this world are just blatantly racist. And it's clear and it's there, and we're not debating it. But those who think, oh, our kids play together and we go to restaurant with Black, those are the ones who really ought to reflect about the choices and the decisions that they make. Yeah.
I think you're right. I've run hopelessly over time, but I've done that because this has been an extraordinary exchange, right? I want to end just by saying, thanking you. As you spoke about that, I thought, precisely, I want my children and my grandchildren to live in a society where that particular sign of distribution of privilege doesn't count anymore. And I think that's been my gripe for a long time. I think there are a whole lot of white people who actually, very significant amount, who have not shifted their paradigm in terms of thinking about what a non-racial, non-society in South Africa means. Now, of course, there are all sorts of people for that, but I stand by that. And I stand also by the fact that you remain one of the great important commentators in our discourse. I was complaining the other day that we don't have the moral voices that we had with Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela and others. Well, we've got people like you. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful.
Thank you. I love your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.